Okay, another very important aspect of the Cold War was the arms race, which was a competition to see who could have the strongest uh, weapons, atomic weapons, and who could have the most of them. Okay, and so here we go with this quick video.
Welcome, History Junkies. I'm Brett, and welcome to another episode of It's History. You probably have already noticed that with the Cold War, there was always a concern for who was better. The East and the West wanted to win every competition. Athletic competition was mostly innocent, but anything less than that, however, was a military match. Everyone wanted to have the latest, the most effective, most dangerous weapon. Yes, we're talking about the arms race. And what exactly is that? Well, the hostile opposing states or alliances increase their spending on tanks, missiles, and a bunch of other military stuff. And of course, if one buys a large rocket, the other has to buy an even bigger rocket. This was basically how the so-called arms race developed. The United States is a member of the military alliance NATO, which was established in 1949. The Soviet Union, however, established its own military alliance in 1955, the Warsaw Pact. Now, it never came to an actual military confrontation between the two alliances. Rather, there were proxy wars. What is a proxy war? Well, it's characterized by two sides fighting to exert power and influence over a third state. In many cases, this third state is under some conflict that the two sides work to exploit for their own purposes. A good example is the Vietnam War from 1965 to 1973. The Soviet Union and China supported North Vietnam with weapons. And what about the United States? Well, they supported and fought on the side of South Vietnam. So back home to the arms race. During the Cold War, the U.S. almost always had the lead. By 1950, the U.S. had 300 nuclear warheads to the Soviets' 10. In 1945, the U.S. released its first nuclear test in the New Mexico desert. A month later, it would drop bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For the United States, it wasn't just about defeating Japan. No, the dispute with the Soviet Union was already heating up by then, and the U.S. wanted to demonstrate its military strength. By 1949, the Soviets finally had their own nuclear test. So let the arms race begin. Step by step, a scenario of nuclear deterrence was drawn up that was a doctrine that based its principles on the idea of mutually assured destruction, short for MAD. Sounds charming, right? There was also talk about a balance of terror. I can tell you this much, it was definitely crazy. In America, in 1953, Dwight D. Eisenhower became president, and he gave guidelines for dealing with the USSR conflict, those of massive retaliation. It stipulates that any attack would be answered with a force large enough to ensure complete destruction. Now, this strategy worked, in a way, as long as the United States remained superior when it came to nuclear weapons. But by this time, in 1956, the Soviets had already shot their satellite Sputnik into space. To the west, if the Soviets could launch into space, they could just as well launch a missile into the United States. Well, when both sides had this ability, the strategy of a massive retaliation no longer seemed to be such a deterrent. By 1962, the USA and Soviet Union are actually on the brink of war. Do you remember our last episode on the Cuban Missile Crisis? That's what we're talking about here. Never before had the East and West been so close to using nuclear weapons. Afterwards, there was a change in attitude as the two sides saw how dangerous it all was. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was an easing of tension between the two superpowers. However, this did not mean disarmament. With an emphasis on stability, the powers agreed on various controls on arms and on a so-called controlled rearmament. That means a limit to the amount of arms that both sides must agree to keeping. In addition, the US and NATO moved away from the principles of massive retaliation. Instead, they developed a flexible response principle, where nuclear weapons could be used only if normal military forces are not sufficient. This principle would be written into NATO doctrine by 1967. And then the following happened. The Soviet Union replaced its older missile systems aimed at targets in Europe with modern weapons, namely the SS-20 missiles. NATO threatened to deploy its own new intermediate-range rockets. In the so-called dual-track decision of 1979, NATO and the Soviet Union entered negotiations mostly geared towards eliminating the SS-20 missiles. Should talks fail, NATO would give itself an upgrade. Now, such means of deterrence was not received well by the Soviets, and shortly afterwards they marched right into Afghanistan. And so the momentary easing of hostilities was over with a bang. But But slowly, everyone began to have enough of this constant threat of mutual destruction. In 1983, US President Ronald Reagan spoke about creating a nuclear-free world for the first time. In the Soviet Union, 2 years later, Mikhail Gorbachev came into power. Now, he was a reformer and wanted to make things different from his authoritarian predecessor. The Soviet Union had economic problems, and Gorbachev knew that they could not keep up in this intensified arms race in the long run. So it was expensive to keep up to date with the newest technology, and Gorbachev wanted to use the money for reform instead of armament policy. Finally, the time came for real disarmament resolutions. At a meeting in Reykjavik, a decision was made to abolish nuclear weapons, a world without nuclear weapons. Well, we still haven't seen that yet. The question is, why did it take so long to finally get to disarmament? Well, for one thing, everyone involved in nuclear balance sort of secured the peace. This balance of terror basically prevented either side from turning things into a hot war. Nevertheless, we must make one thing clear. The whole situation was more a non-peace, because let's face it, this so-called peace could become a nuclear war within a short period of time, which could destroy a large part of humanity. And by the way, my new colleague Guy also made a great episode about the history of weapons of mass destruction.
Okay, and so there was a quick video on the Cold War arms race, okay, which is actually the arms race and the space race, which I'm going to do next, is actually the real reason for the collapse of the Soviet Empire. Sorry, the collapse of communism, because like he said, if we buy one, then they're going to want to buy two, and this and that, and bigger one, and blah blah. And so we forced them to outspend themselves, and so that's definitely one of the major realistic reasons why the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989.